For as far back as it's possible to know, and likely long before that, human beings have been playing games that are a combination of chance and strategy. In backgammon, or its even more ancient ancestor, the royal game of Ur, players start their turn by rolling dice, and naturally, the unpredictable outcome of that roll is where chance enters the game. After a random number has been generated, however, the remainder of the player's turn is pure strategy, as they do their best to choose the right counters to move and attempt to pick the most beneficial of the options made possible by their roll. And yet, while you can try to plan ahead in these games with a grand scheme for victory, on a turn-by-turn basis, you will always be at the whims of luck, always reacting to what the game gives you and trying to fold those unpredictable options into your wider objective. First comes chance, with strategy following after. Fast forward 5,000 years, and that combination of chance and strategy is one that many humans still find irresistible. In today's gaming landscape, it's an impulse that is perhaps best expressed in the roguelike deck builder, a mouthful of a genre that draws its elements of chance not from dice, but from a pack of cards. The basic outline of these games looks like this. You're given a starting deck of cards and need to use them to solve some kind of problem, almost always a sort of combat encounter. Each turn of combat sees you drawing a random hand from your deck, reacting to the cards you get, and trying to make the best decisions you can with the options available. First chance, then strategy. These encounters are mostly self-contained, but there's often a stat that persists between them, like health, that nudges you into thinking long-term and keeping losses in each battle to a minimum. In between encounters, you're given the opportunity to manage your deck, adding, upgrading, or removing cards as you see fit, but restricted either by limited and randomized options, or by a currency that stops you from buying everything and forces you to prioritize. As you make your way through your run, you'll hopefully be assembling a deck of cards that synergize together well enough to carry you to the boss encounter at the end. If you fail to do this and lose an encounter, either by making bad decisions or just by getting unlucky with your cards, your run is over and you're sent back to the menu to start a new one from the beginning. So, from that quick description, it should be clear enough that fortune plays a major role in the roguelike deck builder, but far from turning players away, that randomness is key to making the genre work. The current preeminent example of the category has got to be Balatro, whose easy-to-grasp concept captured the space's attention and drew in millions of players for countless hours. Hearing the music right now might be producing a flush-hunting Pavlovian response in you even as I speak. When you start a game of Balatro, you're at the mercy of chance and have no idea what lies ahead of you, both on a turn-by-turn basis and in a wider sense across the entire run. Faced with this solid wall of unpredictability, your role as the player is to remove as much randomness from the equation as possible, and to put yourself on as certain a path to victory as you feasibly can by nudging probability in your favour. Increasing the value of favoured hands or cards in your deck, removing weaker ones that don't complement them, and finding ways to optimize the options available to you at any given moment. Crucially, the strategy you arrive at for each run can't be planned in advance, since you don't know which abilities or modifiers are coming down the pipeline. Instead, your approach needs to be developed on the fly in response to the choices you're presented with. All this is to say that even the strategic side of roguelike deck builders is largely governed by chance, and regardless of how perfectly you make your choices, sometimes victory simply isn't in the cards. I can't deny that it feels good when luck is on your side and the outcome that you were hoping for falls right into your lap, but the obvious follow-up to that is that when luck is not on your side, it feels frustrating and at worst makes you wonder why you're bothering to invest your time into a game that's essentially just several hundred dice rolls in a row. In its defense, Balatro pulls a few tricks that make your enslavement to chance more palatable. In most entries in the genre, repeating the early stages of a run can get quite boring because of how simple and repetitive they are. And while that's true in Balatro as well, the game is so fast-paced that you can speed through the first few rounds relatively quickly. By the time you reach the second half of a run, it's likely that you'll have enough money to make liberal use of rerolls and give yourself a lot more options in the shop in between rounds, which helps to reduce the influence of chance. And yet despite all that, there's a question that hangs over me whenever I play Balatro, or any other roguelike that relies heavily on randomness. Did I lose that encounter because I made the wrong choices, or because I was unlucky? I suppose the answer lies somewhere in the middle, and I'm sure I can't be alone in finding that unsatisfying. Now, this has been a pretty long intro even for me, but I felt that a bit of context was necessary in order to lay out my thoughts on the genre and explain why I'm usually not a big fan of it, despite having tried a lot of the games that are considered to be its peak. And so, when I first fired up the deck builder Death Howl, maybe you can see why it came as such a pleasant surprise to discover that it really clicked with me. A self-described Souls-like deck builder, Death Howl contains the expected combination of chance and strategy, as each turn of combat gives you a random hand of cards from your deck and asks you to do your best to adapt to the options they present, but it also features a number of elements that will be familiar to any fan of FromSoft. There are bonfires that heal you and restore defeated enemies, there's a currency that you drop on death and get a chance to retrieve, there are boss fights with screen-spanning health bars, there are obtuse quests and hidden walls galore, and there's even a poison swamp. I'll get into how Death Howl both uses and avoids the conventions of the two genres it's pulling from, but before going any further, there's something I should reveal that viewers well versed in deck builders may have already picked up on, a crucial difference that separates this game from many like it. It may be a deck builder, but Death Howl is not a roguelike. Failing a battle in Death Howl doesn't mean failing a run and being sent back to a menu. In fact, there are no runs, just a single playthrough that allows you to fail and experiment as much as you need to. If you lose a fight, you drop your currency, which is almost always a very small amount, but there's no other penalty besides that. You're sent back outside the encounter with the same health you had beforehand, and you're free to dive straight back in if you so wish. The deck you take into battle is one that you've modified and customized throughout your playthrough, but there is zero randomness in its composition. You'll slowly gain access to a wide variety of new cards as you play, and you can assemble them into decks of 20 however and whenever you please, figuring out synergies and designing strategies based not on what the game randomly gave you, but on your own preferences according to your playstyle and your understanding of the rules. What this means is that all of the randomness in Death Howl is short term and purely comes down to which cards are drawn on each turn. Everything else is firmly in the player's hands and down to their own strategizing. There is still the occasional turn where things come down to a lucky draw, but I find that more forgivable here than elsewhere because Death Howl is a game of chance where you design the dice. There's plenty more to dig into here, but I think I've said enough for you to know whether this is a game you'd like to play yourself before watching more, so consider the rest of this paragraph your spoiler warning. Death Howl gets an easy recommendation regardless of whether you're usually into deck builders, since it sidesteps a lot of the problems I often have with the genre, mainly by throwing out the roguelike elements and having more of a structure to it. The huge diversity in cards and enemy types, along with the 4 regions of the map that each heavily encourage using a different set of cards, mean that as you proceed through the game, there's almost always a fresh challenge in front of you, keeping things interesting. And once it's shown you everything it has to offer, Death Howl has the grace to actually wrap itself up with an ending and allow you to move on to something else, which is always appreciated. While I do have some criticisms of it, my deck of thoughts for this game is stacked with more praise than complaint, and I thoroughly enjoyed the original spin it brought to some very well-trodden concepts. So let's draw a hand and get to it. In Death Howl, you take on the role of Ro, a grieving mother and shaman in training who enters the spirit world to seek out and bring back her recently deceased young son. The intricacies of that story are drip-fed slowly across a playthrough and are mostly obscured from the player by deliberate vagueness, but it succeeds at setting the somber tone that permeates throughout the experience. It's not until the very end of the game that the story is pulled together and laid out clearly, and it's enjoyable for what it is, but it's not the part of the game I find interesting, so I won't be going into detail. In any case, the central conceit of searching for a lost child is more than enough to propel you forward in the beginning. I'm a sucker for good pixel art, and the visuals here are often gorgeously expressive, especially in cutscenes and other set-piece moments. As you move around, the landscape is literally drawn into existence in front of you, and each region of the world has different flora and fauna that scuttle away from you or sway in the breeze. The impression given is one of a spirit world pulsing with hidden energy. Transitioning seamlessly between exploration and battle is a neat little trick that strikes a great balance between maintaining visual continuity and removing needless clutter as everything outside the current game board fades away. The art on the playing cards is nice enough and serves to quickly distinguish them from one another, but you're not likely to spend much time appreciating them in battle when your brain is in strategy mode. And speaking of which, it's about time I start unpacking the mechanics on offer in this game, so let's start from the beginning with a breakdown. Combat in Death Howl takes place on a grid of a shape determined by the surrounding environment. Sometimes they're narrow and suffocating, sometimes they're more open, sometimes there are obstacles or items to interact with. Once you've chosen your starting location, your aim in each encounter is, obviously enough, to dispatch all the enemies, usually with the secondary but equally important goal of preserving as much of your own health as possible, since you'll be carrying that number into the next battle. On each of your turns, you're given 5 cards from your deck and 5 mana points, which can be spent either on movement or on playing a card, and there are 3 main axes of effect that these cards revolve around: damaging enemies, moving between tiles, and building up block that protects you from damage. Of these 3 criteria, only attacking enemies is truly essential for winning battles, so when it comes to the problem of avoiding damage yourself, there's a spectrum of strategies for you to design your deck around. At one extreme of that spectrum, you can stay out of enemy range to keep them harmlessly chasing you around, and at the other extreme, you can shield yourself and tank every hit. It's entirely up to you where your playstyle falls on this spectrum, but the starting deck you're handed in the introduction offers a sensible mix of options, around 60-20-20 in favour of attack cards, which gives you a good rule of thumb to follow when designing your own decks later on. When it comes to actually using your deck to solve problems and win battles, there's an astounding amount of diversity among the enemies you'll come up against. Some attack up close, some attack from range, some teleport around, some jump over obstacles. Some push you with attacks, some pull you with attacks, some explode as their attack. Some move after being hit, some gain block after being hit, some retaliate with a counter after being hit. Some have a lot of health but are weak to backstabs, some start with a lot of block but lose it after moving. Some will heal other enemies, some will resurrect other enemies. Some will poison you, some will weaken you, some will make you fragile. Some take mana away from you as long as they're alive, some add detrimental cards to your hand or deck. Some have a turn countdown that insta-kills you, some will just insta-kill you if they get too close. And to top it all off, almost every enemy also has a stronger variant with more health and an extra ability that makes them even more threatening. Different areas of the map can also bring their own twists to encounters. In the snowy region, a chill effect will slowly sap your health each turn, and some enemies will start the battle frozen in ice and vulnerable to being quickly dispatched before they break out. I could keep going with a much longer list, but I think that's more than enough to get the point across and show that creative battle mechanics are one of this game's strongest features. By scattering these vastly different enemy types across the game in a variety of combinations and on boards of various shapes and sizes, Death Howl gets a lot of mileage out of them and is able to make every battle feel like a new challenge, distinct from the others around it. The different enemies present in a battle will directly determine your strategy for that encounter. For instance, you pretty much always need to go for these goat bastards first, otherwise they can resurrect defeated foes on their turn and undo your progress. Sometimes, however, that means running straight past an even stronger enemy that would usually command your full attention, so you'll want to have some way of making sure you can outrun it, or push it away, or freeze it in place, or block its attack. Maybe you're starting to see why assembling a deck with a good balance of options is so essential, and why there's more tactical depth on offer here than just choosing which order to tackle enemies. Now, of course, with this being a deck builder, there's only so much strategizing you can do before you're placed at the mercy of chance, and each of your turns will see your long-term plan for the encounter colliding with the short-term options afforded by your drawn hand. To its credit, Death Howl is less influenced by randomness than most entries in the genre, but in any game with mechanics dependent on RNG, it's unavoidable that luck plays a role. In the short term, chance enters the game with the cards drawn for each hand, and each turn is about furthering your battle plan by making the most out of whatever options have landed in your lap. When it comes to planning ahead for future turns, enemies behave largely predictably, and you can pretty much always count on them to either try and move into range to attack you, or occasionally to cast a buff on themselves and others. What you can't predict, however, are the cards you're going to draw in the next hand, or the one after that, so each battle becomes this satisfying little rhythmic cycle of strategy, reaction, and adaptation, as you refine and modify your plan each turn according to the options you've been provided. If you ever find yourself in a position where there's truly nothing in your hand that's helpful to you in any way, then it's quite likely that the issue is your deck and not your luck. But even in those situations, you're still able to use your mana to run away and put yourself in a better position for the next turn. If even that isn't possible, then you have a generous enough health pool that you can comfortably take a few hits before you're in the danger zone, which does a good job at smoothing over the impact of bad luck and bad decisions alike. So by now, hopefully you can see why I think that the randomness in Death Howl is used in a more controlled and controllable way than in your average deck builder. But that's not to say that chance can't still stick its fingers in your plans and mess with you. Pulling a lucky starting hand can make an appreciable difference in battle if it means that you're able to remove an enemy from the board on your first turn. But the opposite can be true as well, and since you always choose your starting location before knowing what your first hand will be, it can be a bit of a gamble. If you pick a dangerous start point with the intention of going on the offensive and then find yourself without enough offensive options, then it doesn't feel particularly good to know that it was only chance that put you in that position. If you have the bright idea of quitting out of a losing battle to try it again from the top, then you'll be given exactly the same hands again, so you're encouraged to see encounters through even if they get off to a bad start, which I suppose is necessary to stop players obsessed with perfection from continually re-rolling their first hand. Technically, you could always die on purpose to start a battle again with the chance of better hands, but since it would take several turns for you to lose all your health anyway, you might as well just stick with what you've got. And in any case, death is discouraged by the Souls-like currency drop mechanic. More on that later. Sometimes, however, the clutch point where luck determines the outcome of a battle comes not at the beginning, but at the end, and those are the moments where the question I mentioned in the intro raises its head highest. Did I lose that encounter because I made the wrong choices, or because I was unlucky? Maybe that doesn't sound so bad, it's just the non-deterministic nature of the genre, isn't it? But that ambiguity leads to a far more problematic question. If I keep losing a battle, is it because I need to change my strategy, or do I just need to get luckier? Sometimes the answer to this is obvious. If you die before you can even take out a single enemy, then you can be reasonably sure that your deck needs some work and that you should come back after unlocking some more powerful cards. But if you came this close to winning and only lost it due to some unfortunate draws at the end, the temptation is strong to jump back in and try again with the exact same deck, hoping for a better roll of the dice this time. That uncertainty over whether to blame luck or strategy for failure can easily lead to you spending over an hour banging your head against a single encounter without changing anything. In most games, repeating the same thing again and again expecting different results would amount to madness, but in Death Howl you can enter the same battle with the same deck, with the same plan and strategy in mind, and sometimes you'll win, sometimes you'll lose. Thankfully, this headbanging scenario happened less than you might expect in my playthrough, but still I see this as a big problem that should be considered and minimized as much as possible. Unfortunately, the area where this issue shows up most often is in the boss fights, which are a bit more reliant on chance than ordinary battles because they usually feature limited windows of vulnerability. If you have the good fortune to draw a high damage card during that window, then you're laughing, but I'm sure you can imagine how frustrating it feels when the reverse happens and you completely miss an opportunity to damage a boss through no fault of your own. This jellyfish boss in particular has an extremely thin margin for error because it's constantly spawning in summons that will insta-kill you if they touch you. If you're forced to delay attacking one so that you can focus on the boss instead, then you're essentially rolling the dice in the hopes that the next turn will provide you with enough offensive options to kill it. If it does, then you're fine, and you can feel satisfied having made the right choice. If it doesn't, then you're probably screwed and it doesn't feel like your fault. Maybe you've already detected the hint of hypocrisy here. When I get the cards I want, it's obviously all because of my elite gaming skills, and when I don't get the cards I want, it's because of bullshit RNG. The reality, of course, is that both outcomes involved a bit of luck, which is the unavoidable conclusion anytime a game involves random elements. But I'll return to that thought in my conclusion because I think the point's been made for now. While I don't love the fact that victory or defeat against a boss can sometimes come down to a coin toss, the short length of battles and the immediate turnaround before getting another try help to make it less of an annoyance. And I mean, boss battles are supposed to be a bit more grueling than the average encounter, so I get why they look this way. Each boss also has some kind of twist or special attack that you'll never see coming on your first attempt. For example, the final boss's highly damaging blast that's triggered mid-turn by walking in front of it, or simply by choosing the wrong starting location. This isn't exactly fair, but it's also a mistake you won't make twice, so learning about these tricks to anticipate and avoid them on your next try is a crucial part of inching towards victory. As your knowledge of the boss improves, you can avoid damage and keep yourself alive for longer, which will give you more opportunities to damage the boss, which reduces the influence of chance over whether you win or lose. That concept of slowly reducing the influence of chance over time is a trick used to great effect in Death Howl, and it serves as one of the major avenues for progression upgrades unlocked across a playthrough using your accumulated currency. One of these unlocks allows you to get a special creature card upon killing an enemy, and the next upgrade along lowers the cost of those bonus cards to make most of them completely free to use. These are temporary and have to be used on the same turn you get them, but they're incredibly useful for chaining together moves and expanding your options. When I went back in for a second playthrough, it felt like the game was missing something until I unlocked them again. Knowing that you'll be able to leap away from danger with a frog card, scare away an enemy with a croc card, or cure yourself of poison with a spider card, just to give a few examples, allows you to focus on quick kills and play a lot more aggressively than you would have to otherwise. In the same vein are the totems, equipable charms that give various benefits in battle and further improve your chances of victory. The more powerful ones come with a penalty attached that turns them into a trade-off of sorts, but there are so many different options that you're sure to find a few purely beneficial ones that complement your strategy if you want to play it safe. For instance, the totem that grants you extra mana for kills was a total game changer for me that boosted my aggressive playstyle and drastically increased the length of my turns during combat. While you start with just one totem slot, this can be expanded to 4 as you explore more regions of the map, making this mechanic into one that slowly makes the game easier over time. Sure enough, the second half of my playthrough was a lot more easygoing than the first, as bad luck had less of an effect on my prospects. And still there's more. Each region has its own limit break overcharge mechanic that builds up when you perform the relevant action for that region, gaining block, taking damage, hitting enemies, that kind of thing. Once you hit the threshold, you can use the limit break to heal or to deal extra damage or replenish some mana for that turn, depending on the region you're in. Yet again, this mechanic grants you additional capabilities that reduce the chances of being stuck in a situation where you have no good options. And once more, it's one that you slowly unlock over time as you invest your upgrade points into it. I'm sure you've spotted the recurring theme by now. One last mechanic worth mentioning here is the summon cards, which spawn a friendly creature into battle to either buff you or attack on your behalf, and even more usefully to aggro enemies and soak up a little damage that would have come for you otherwise. There's more luck involved in making use of summons than the other mechanics I've just mentioned, since they're cards like any other and can only be played if they get drawn at an opportune time. Pulling one in your first hand obviously puts you in a strong position for that battle, but if the card comes at the wrong moment, then you might be unable to play it without taking damage or tanking your strategy in some way. This doesn't make them a bad mechanic by any means, and it asks you to bring the same dexterity and ability to adapt to circumstances that so much of this game does, but it also drags us right back to that question of luck versus skill that seems so inevitable when discussing Death Howl. I promised to shelf that topic until the end of the video though, so for now let's move on to what the player is doing whenever they're not in a battle. Mostly what it comes down to is managing your deck, navigating the map, and completing quests, with a few different interactions between those features. As you explore, you'll activate sacred groves, which serve as this game's version of Souls-like bonfires, and are used for quickly teleporting around, refilling your health, and banking currency, with the last two options also causing all defeated enemies to reappear. The currency in question is Death Howls, which are gained from killing enemies and are either spent on new cards in the menu or turned into upgrade teardrops at a bonfire. Those teardrops are what you use to purchase upgrades like the totem slots and limit break abilities I mentioned a moment ago. Before you can buy new cards for your deck, however, you first need to unlock them in the menu by grabbing the required amount of materials in that region, either as drops from enemies or as items lying around in the overworld. Each time you reach the target amount, another 4 cards are unlocked and available for purchase in that region, which makes for a steady drip feed of new options being introduced. But after 1.5 playthroughs of the game, I think this system can be a little tedious. With so many different strategies available to the player in combat, it's likely that you've settled on a playstyle that makes certain cards far more desirable than others. And in fact, it's possible, even probable, that most card unlocks won't actually be very useful to you at all. This means that you're often left with nothing good to spend a big stack of Death Howls on, other than banking them and turning them into upgrade teardrops, which always felt like a waste to me, but was pretty much unavoidable since it's also the only way to heal at a bonfire. To make matters worse, once you've gained enough teardrops to unlock every upgrade, getting more through exploration, or banking Death Howls, or as rewards from quests, is completely pointless with nothing else to spend them on, so again it feels like a waste of a mechanic. On my blind first playthrough, I could mostly forgive the teardrops becoming less valuable over time and the new card unlocks being useless to me, even if it was sort of deflating to reach a milestone and then have nothing practical to show for it. When I started the game again for a second time, however, I found myself frustrated by the amount of grinding it took to unlock the cards I actually wanted, so there's definitely room for improvement here. A bit of input from the player for the order cards become available might go a long way towards alleviating this. Maybe a choice between a pack of attack, block or movement cards each time you reach the unlock threshold. Now you may have noticed a minute ago that I said each region of the map has its own independent material threshold for new unlocks, and that's because they also each have their own independent pool of cards, usually designed with that area's enemies or peculiarities in mind. Using cards obtained from a different region to the one you're currently in is heavily discouraged because they'll cost an extra point of mana to use in battle, which is so severely limiting that it's just not worth it. This means that whenever you enter a region of the map for the first time, you're essentially sent back to square one and have to build up a new deck from scratch, a cycle that repeats itself 4 times across the game. This is yet another way that the game is able to constantly put fresh challenges in front of the player, and it stops you from getting too complacent or reliant on the same deck or strategy for your entire playthrough. The creature cards and limit break abilities are aligned with this as well, since they're also purchased and upgraded separately per region. Once you've built a deck that's good enough to carry you to the end of a region and beat the boss, it's time to move on and start again with something new. On the whole, I like this a lot, and I really appreciate the forward momentum it brings to the game, but there is one thing I find a little puzzling about it. On the game's Steam page, there's a promo pic showing off a bunch of different custom decks with names like Move and Die, Backstabbing, or Mountain of Block, each one presumably built around a different strategy. But designing decks like that doesn't really make a lot of sense when you're actually playing the game, since you unlock new cards so gradually in each region, and once you've beaten a boss there's no reason to come back and no reason to use any of the cards in that deck again. The way you're far more likely to build your decks is to just have one set aside for each area, and to slowly add more specific cards to it as they get unlocked. My decks were all named after the region I used them in, rather than on any kind of overarching strategy I had. To be clear, I'm absolutely not accusing the devs of false advertising on their store page or anything like that, and in actual fact I'm very happy with how Death Howl incentivizes the player to assemble different decks across a playthrough, but I just thought it was worth mentioning as another case where just because the player can do something, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're mechanically incentivized to do so. So that just about covers acquiring new cards and turning them into decks, but while I'm here, I might as well do a little complaining about how gathering materials works too. buying new cards doesn't only cost Death Howls, it also costs you some of the resources you've gathered from exploration and battle. Getting those materials as a reward for success in battle makes a lot of sense, and it also allows you to deliberately hunt for specific ones by seeking out an encounter with the relevant enemy, which is handy if there's a certain card you want to prioritize purchasing. As for the materials you find on the floor while exploring, it all feels a bit arbitrary, and there's no way to know in advance where you might find the one you're looking for. A lot of time is spent in between battles just walking around and clicking on resources without really paying attention or absorbing what any of them are. Sometimes when I was missing the material for a card I wanted to unlock, I didn't even notice I'd picked it up until I checked the menu again later and realized it was in my inventory. I get that these collectible resources are there to reward exploration and to give you a way to reach new card unlocks without having to grind old battles repeatedly, but that could just as easily have been alleviated by lowering the required threshold for new cards, and I just don't really see these environmental resources as adding much to the experience. Thankfully, the open plan design of the world is still able to justify its existence through some other clever mechanics that emerge from it. Battles are placed in each region at choke points that force you to win them in order to get past, and this can occasionally lead to some interesting decisions to make about which direction to approach from. In this encounter, for example, there's one of those goats that respawns defeated enemies, but he's hiding away at the back of his squad, which means you're extremely exposed if you try to get over there and focus him down. Assuming that is, you're approaching the battle from the north side. If you approach from the south, you'll start the encounter with him isolated right next to you and can go for the quick kill. This sounds like a no-brainer, but the catch is that approaching from the south means clearing a bunch of other encounters to get to it, at the risk of losing some health before getting there. With plenty of different paths to navigate and routes to pick from, Death Howl's map is full of intriguing trade-offs like this, and crucial to making them work is the fact that your health persists between encounters. When you're exploring a region for the first time and haven't activated a bonfire to uncover the map yet, it can be quite nerve-wracking as you carefully inch forward battle by battle, hoping that you still have enough health left to get you through whatever's ahead to the next rest spot. It doesn't get much more Souls-like than that. When you take on a series of encounters in a row, you're also running the risk of dying and losing your current stack of Death Howls, though this number is usually small enough that it's not a major concern, and I never found it to be a very interesting mechanic given how easy it is to grind them if you really need to. The drop your currency mechanic that we all know and love is present and accounted for, but again I don't think it really adds much here besides ticking off an item on the Souls-like checklist. If you die, you have one chance to head back into the battle you just lost to retrieve your Death Howls by collecting them from a tile, but if an enemy steps on them then they're gone and the enemy gets a damage boost. This might sound like it could lead to some exciting clutch moments, but in practice it was a mechanic that I more or less ignored. Wasting your turns on going out of your way to retrieve your souls can put you at a serious disadvantage in combat, and since we're talking about an encounter that literally just killed you and is presumably a tricky one, it's really not worth it for a resource so easily obtained elsewhere. The only resource I actually cared about carrying between battles was health, for the reasons I mentioned a minute ago, and the uncertainty over whether I would be able to make it to the next bonfire was more than enough to keep me in suspense across a string of battles. Admittedly, this tension eases off a little once you've obtained an area's map, and especially once you've activated enough bonfires to teleport around with ease, but it never leaves the game completely because of one last feature that places restrictions on you and necessitates careful navigation: the quests. Generally speaking, quests in Death Howl come in two forms. One type is given by NPCs and shows up in your quest log, and usually revolves around collecting something and then moving it to some other location, with the complication being that that something appears as a card in your deck to either help or hinder you. Whenever you're holding a special quest card like this, you're still able to heal at bonfires, but you're restricted from teleporting, so you have to carefully plan out a route to your destination that will give you the best chance of getting there in one piece. On the whole, I enjoyed these quests because they offered a navigational challenge and gave some more meaning to the open structure of the world. The other type of quest is hidden and doesn't appear in the log. Instead, you have to notice something in the world and figure out its meaning for yourself. and my reception of these was a little more mixed. Sometimes it's in the realm of spotting a suspicious pattern on the floor and recreating it elsewhere, which is totally fine if a little uninspired. But sometimes it can get a lot more obtuse, and there was more than one occasion where I had to look something up and felt more annoyed than enlightened. It's obvious that there's something you're supposed to do here in this clearing of floating rocks, but there was only so much of my time I was willing to waste banging my head against it trying things at random. So when I looked it up and discovered that the solution was to click on this pool at the other side of the area not once but multiple times, I wasn't exactly thrilled. There's nothing interesting or challenging about this, it's just a guessing game where you blindly try to figure out what the game wants from you. Your reward for completing quests is usually a new card or a number of teardrops or materials, but the real prize for engaging with them is that sometimes they end with a battle against a mini-boss. Fortunately, these unique encounters are usually worth the obscure preamble, and offer some of the most enjoyable optional challenges in the game, which is why it's kind of a shame that they're so easy to inadvertently miss out on. But since you're likely to find at least a few of them, I think it's fair enough for some to be hidden for only the true faithful to discover. There are a couple of other nitpicks I could air out here as I begin to wrap up the video, but I don't think it's worth it this close to the end, and I don't want to leave you with a negative impression of the game because I had a great time with it and would easily recommend it. So now that I've unpacked pretty much every element of Death Howl, there's only one thing left to cover before moving on to my conclusion. After beating the boss in each of the game's 4 regions, it's finally time to ascend the mountain in the center of the map. But here there's a unique twist that allows you to use everything you've learned throughout your entire playthrough in an excellent culmination of all the game's mechanics. On this final mountain, all cards from all regions are available to play in your deck with no penalties, which gives you the opportunity to open the deck building menu one last time and assemble your ultimate deck out of all your favorite cards. This closing area even introduces a new enemy type, which is actually the most random of any in the game, since it can morph unpredictably into any other enemy. But at this point, with so many limitations removed, you should be more than powerful enough to headbutt your way through any randomness on your way up to the summit. Once you've got over his laser blast that breaks the usual rules of the game, the final boss also makes for a satisfying ending, though the short second phase that follows was over a bit too quickly for me to fully understand what was going on mechanically. The story gets revealed in full and concludes on a bittersweet note, as Ro eventually grows to accept the loss of her son and leaves the spirit world behind to rejoin the living. And there you have it. The credits roll and our time with Death Howl comes to an end, which means it's time to shuffle the deck one final time and try to draw some meaningful conclusions from it all. There's a question I've left unanswered until now that I think requires some exploration before the final word on Death Howl. That is, why introduce any element of randomness at all? Why not make a game that's fully deterministic and 100% predictable? Well, here it seems appropriate to return to those ancient boards from millennia ago. Why did they involve chance? Without the RNG introduced by a dice roll, those simple games could easily be optimized and solved, and would play out exactly the same every time. In fact, the only way to prevent this is to inject a degree of unpredictability that can't be forecast and needs to be reacted to in the moment. Whichever ancient game designer figured this out kickstarted a tradition that has echoed down the ages to the present day, where practically all games involve some level of randomness for players to react to, with the notable exception of puzzle and logic games where finding the single solution allowed by the rules is the entire point. Even in an action game, the attacks and movements of enemies and bosses are randomly drawn from a pool. If they weren't, and they did the exact same pattern every time, you could quickly learn to beat them by memorization, rather than by improving your skills of reaction and adaptation. Returning to Death Howl, if there were no random elements, then every encounter would be solvable the instant you saw the starting position of the board. Some degree of randomness then is absolutely essential to game design, and the point of it, as it has been for thousands of years, is to create a challenge that's always unpredictable and requires constant re-evaluation and input from the player. I say all this to make it clear that I'm not against randomness in principle, only in implementation. As you should know by now, Death Howl is not a roguelike, so perhaps it's not surprising that it relies less on chance than most of that genre, and it also means that when you've finished it, you've actually finished it, rather than being expected to jump straight back in to spin the wheel and play again. I don't mean to denigrate the entire roguelike genre here, and this is just a personal preference as my tastes have changed over time, but in case you can't tell, I'm getting a little bit tired of games that never end and demand to be played forever. I'm not saying there's nothing left unexplored in the possibility space of the genre, but I am saying that a lot of games have had a shake at it in the last decade, and it's going to take something very unique and special to breathe new life into it at this point. The fact that Death Howl stood out so strongly to me simply by not containing roguelike elements should tell you something about just how saturated the category has become. Maybe this seems like an unfair comparison to you. What could I possibly hope to prove by contrasting games that aren't even in the same genre? Well, what it comes down to for me, and why I think the juxtaposition is justified, is the way that Death Howl uses randomness so differently to your average roguelike deck builder. Barring a couple of minor exceptions, for 99% of Death Howl, the only random element is the cards drawn at the start of your turn. Everything else, from deck composition to damage values to enemy movements and actions, are either completely in the player's hands or completely predictable, which amounts to the same thing in the end. There's a lot to learn about the mechanics of different strategies, enemies, bosses and regions throughout a playthrough, and once you've seen everything an area has to offer, you can move on and are never forced to replay it again just to get to the more interesting bits. While it's still occasionally possible for the result of a battle to come down to chance in Death Howl, the game knows this and, as if by way of apology, makes the penalty for failure almost negligible. Compare all of that to the usual deck builder, where your deck starts the same every run, but the modifications you're able to make to it, and the enemies and bosses you end up using it against, are randomly determined with only minor input from the player. If your luck fails you enough times in a row, then it's game over and you're sent right back to the start to replay the tedious early stages all over again. I want to repeat that it's not my intention here to disparage the roguelike genre or the players who enjoy it. I've fallen victim to a few of them myself over the years, so I'm well aware that if one of these games clicks with you in just the right way, it's possible to get a near endless amount of entertainment from exploring its emergent systems. And even if not every run has a chance of reaching the end, you can always rest safe in the knowledge that no two will ever be exactly alike. But let's just stop for a second and think about what that really means, because when a game keeps me playing by tickling the same part of my brain that predatory gambling companies exploit to drain money out of vulnerable people's wallets, let's just say that a big red flag starts waving. When you come out the other side of a 5-hour Balatro trance, you've got to ask yourself, did I just spend 5 hours playing Balatro because it's good? Or did I spend 5 hours playing Balatro because it hijacked the reward center of my brain? To put it another way, the only point of Balatro, insofar as it has one, is to make you keep playing Balatro. That old promise of just one more try is a mantra that animates the prefrontal cortex of gamers and gamblers alike, but I would like to imagine that there's a difference. That when I want one more try at a boss or a difficult section, it's because I think my skills are improving and I can do better, not because I want to roll some dice and receive some dopamine from the anticipation of an uncertain outcome. The modern roguelike occupies a space somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, and from where I'm sitting, it seems to be slowly creeping in the wrong direction. By rejecting the endlessly repeating structure of other deck builders and using randomness just sparingly enough to create an array of constantly evolving challenges, Death Howl becomes a kind of anti-roguelike that allows and wants the player to see everything it has to offer in a single playthrough. The point of Death Howl isn't to keep you playing forever. Framed through the narrative of a grieving mother's desperate struggle, the point is to lead you through the possibility space of the game's mechanics as it frequently presents new obstacles that prompt you to continually adapt and overcome. It's not perfect, and there are moments where it stumbles in this goal and repeats itself. But if, like me, you're getting tired of games that gamble with your attention, then you won't regret taking a chance on Death Howl.